Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2020, and this is kind of a return to our regular programming where we're going to talk about therapy issues. When I get to the point where there are live questions, you're welcome to ask any questions therapeutically as it might relate to the situation that we're all being confronted with right now with the COVID virus. But with that, for right now, I'm going to go back into, like I said, kind of our regularly scheduled programming about therapy and therapeutic issues as they relate to your child. I love this topic. It really, for me, is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and that is how therapy can help and how to get the most out of it. I know for myself that I at times have been challenged by therapists that were less than adequate. And that's even after having a doctoral degree in the subject and having many years of experience in therapy. And so I've thought how much compassion I have for parents that aren't trained in the art and science of therapy, how challenging it can be for them. And I think, unfortunately, there can be a lot of abuse, might be too strong of a word, but there can be a lot of treatment that is far less than ideal. I was talking recently to a client of mine who I had in our program years and years ago. In fact, there was one specific incident with this particular client where I'd made a series of mistakes with the client and had to go back and apologize, talk to my therapist about it, kind of used her for my supervision. And I learned from that experience that the most helpful thing would be to go back out to the field and to apologize to my young client. And we were talking about this idea about finding therapists and what that looks like. And, what I said is that sometimes there are no shortcuts. I don't know all of them because I couldn't have gotten to where I am today without making the mistakes that I made, unfortunately. The idea of my training is to try to shorten that learning curve, condense it as much as possible. But the fact of the matter is, therapy is a practice. And the reason why that's so important for the audience members tonight, for the listeners and watchers tonight, is that we're not perfect. There's a quote in my new book, if you've read it, that somebody was doing a little thought experiment for themselves about if they could tell the difference between the clients in a mental health hospital, the difference between the patients and the therapists. And they came to the conclusion that the difference was the therapist had keys. In fact, I told the story to my wife, and she shared with me that our therapist one time left their keys and was trying to get out of the mental health hospital, and they wouldn't let her out of the hospital without her keys because there was no way to differentiate between the client, the patient, and the therapist, because of course a lot of therapists, a lot of clients, patients would pretend to be, would even think that they're clients. I think it's just the idea that this is a humble profession, ought to be a humble profession, and that there are so many things that can get in the way of effective practice. And so what I want to arm you all with is some tools or keys that can help you. I'll start off with a quote from J.D. Gill. J.D. says, "The therapist or guide we choose must not duplicate the wounds of the past. Thus, if the therapist or guide knows what is right for us and manipulates us to achieve these treatment goals, it is abuse, plain and simple. It is hard to see how good abuse ever cures bad abuse." And so some things, it's not unlike parenting or being in a marital relationship or a partnership or even a friendship. Some of the things that we hide behind well-intentioned, that we say come from a good place, still can take on an abusive form. I've told the story that I was driving my 12-year-old, she was probably 12 at the time, maybe 11, driving her to her Saturday morning therapy session. And I said, "What are you going to talk about today?" And she said, "I'm not quite sure. What do you think I should talk about?" And I said, I don't know what you should talk about." But I said, "But I do know one thing, that if your therapist starts to lecture you or give you advice, you can tell her that you don't need that. You already have parents for that." Right? So part of our awareness around the therapeutic relationship is that the therapist doesn't know what's best for you. They don't know your answer, your truth. The idea is to create a place. I mean, they have an expertise, but that expertise is in creating a place in time with you where you can discover your truth, your deepest, most authentic, most honest truths. And so that's the expertise of the therapist, is creating that kind of a space, that kind of a process. I posted this on social media yesterday or the day before. And I want that in preparation for this broadcast, I wanted to talk about the things that we look for in a therapist. And I came up with a list of 7 things to look for. My wife tells me anything over 8 is too much. So I got it down to 7. And I came up with this list, which I'll read to you and then go over them one by one. And here's the list I came up with. 7 things to look for in a therapist. Number 1, someone who looks for you. Number 2, they listen to understand, not diagnose. Number 3, if you get upset with them, they don't make you the problem. Number 4, apologizes when they make a mistake or hurt you. Number 5, they aren't anxious to fix you. Number 6, they're able to laugh at themselves, not take themselves too seriously. And number 7, they don't need to be a good therapist, or they don't need you to think they're a good therapist. So let's take these one at a time along with some other ideas. In the foreword of my book, very similar to this idea, J.D. Gill writes, a well-trained therapist is an expert at listening. He or she wants to hear how you feel, not how you're supposed to feel. I think a lot of us can relate to that idea during the COVID virus, because we're having oscillating feelings, right? Feelings all over the place. You might be having feelings that wax and wane in contrast to people in your immediate circle, as we're all housed together and asked to stay in place. And so this becomes particularly important, that a therapist is able to understand how you feel, not how you're supposed to, not how you should feel. He or she will try to find you, JD goes on to say, where you are. He or she will try to find out how it feels to be you, with your history, your dilemmas, your hopes and fears. If instead of trying to hear and find you, your therapist has the right answer for you, find another therapist. The right answer will be the therapist's answer and not your answer. This will likely duplicate the ways you were treated by your parents. And I'm a parent, and I know that idea that I can fall under the spell, that I know what my children's path needs to be. Right? That's an easy thing for all of us to get confused by. We don't want our children to hurt and to suffer. Ironically, our own hurting and suffering caused us to learn the wisdom that we have, but we don't want our children to suffer because we love them and it pains us to watch them hurt. So we try to prevent the missteps, the sidesteps in the process. So let's take these one at a time. Let's start off with somebody who looks for you. That's a therapeutic kind of idea, an abstract idea, but let's talk about what it looks like when somebody looks for you. This is somebody who's interested in finding you, right? Finding out who you are, what makes you tick, what your background is, what your context is. I've told this story. It's in my first book. It's one of my favorite stories to illustrate this idea. My therapist told her this story. So I always joke and say it's my grandparent therapist. She described on working with a client over the course of several years. And the client that she was working with grew up in a farm in rural Germany. And in the farm, near the farm, there was this river that ran through the land. And that's just the backdrop. Anyway, when this client would tell stories, it was hard to distinguish at times in this kind of therapy that they were doing, whether or not the client was talking about if they were talking about the current day piece, or if they were talking about something from childhood or historical. And one day, while listening to a story, the therapist had that wondering about, was this historical or present day? And then the answer came to her. She said, I realized that she was talking about her childhood because I could smell the river near where she grew up. And while that's poetic language, it really talks about the earnestness. It illustrates the earnestness of this particular therapist in trying to find and discover the child's context. I think there are so many self-help ideas, books, suggestions, and quotes that tell us, for example, that we don't need our fear anymore, a fear or a past trauma that we've experienced, that we don't need to feel that fear anymore. And I think what that doesn't do is that doesn't give the kind of kindness that the child inside of us needs, requires. Instead of telling the little child inside of us, the one that's scared, that reacts to current day situations in bigger ways than are needed because we have this old history, right? Like from Al Anon, if it's hysterical, it's historical. A therapist who makes it the project to find and see the client will understand that context. And instead of telling you it's your neuroses, telling you it's your narcissism, telling you it's your issue, your pathology, your defense, they'll understand, right? They'll see it and it'll make sense. It's like the quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that says, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each man's story sorrow sufficient to disarm all hostility. Or more simply put, as Abraham Lincoln once said of an acquaintance, I do not like that man. I must get to know him. If we understand somebody's story, and I think in a way, that's what therapy is. One of the ways that I'll talk or train new therapists is I'll say, it is your job to find the client and their story in which everything that they're doing makes sense. That's our job over and over again. Find the client and their context where everything that you would think sounds crazy or irrational makes perfect sense. And it does exist. That context does exist. And you help the client discover it for themselves. You reflect it back. You offer observations and what you hear back to them to see if it fits for them. And then they can learn to tell their story. They can learn to live in it. We can honor it. Or sometimes, as we do in the case at Evoke with our therapy, is we tell the story to the parents. Right? That's the reframe that's going on a lot of your parent phone calls, is we're telling you why it makes sense, where it comes from. Why for them this is a perfectly rational and logical response to a situation. And then that story asks certain things of us. It offers compassion, for sure, but it also it asks us to respond in certain ways to the child in this case, or to the client. They don't let their agenda, this is important because most therapists would argue that their agenda is for good. But even with that idea, they don't let their agenda, their theory, or their technique eclipse the client, eclipse you. Some people get very rigidly attached to their agenda. You know, some clients will ask me, should I try EMDR? Should I try brain spotting? Those are not techniques that I'm trained in. And my response is, I've heard from some people that it works for them. So absolutely try anything. Try somatic experiencing. Try anything that you want to try that you think will work. Try not seeing me if that's what you think will help. Try seeing somebody else. So you try to see the client and you offer back a sense to them that at the deepest level, they're okay. I told this story recently, a couple of stories I'm going to combine here. Recently, I inadvertently hurt somebody that I care about, that I did not intend to hurt. And they texted me and told me about it. It was in some interaction we had through emails. And it was an evening, I was watching a movie with my family a few nights ago. And when this person told me the story, I spent the first 20 seconds trying to make it not true, trying to make what they said I did, which I did do, not true. And when I woke up from that idea, that effort to try to just deny it, create a world where I was good, I realized I need to be accountable and lean into this. And I wrote back and we ended up having a great talk and worked through it. And I apologized. And I reflected on that experience, that initial impulse to create a world where I didn't do what I did do. Right? That's the defense. That's denial. That's what we do. Jamie, my therapist, said last week when one of the individuals on the broadcast was asking a question about how a husband, I think it was, doesn't want to go to therapy. Thinks it's just navel gazing, right? It's just a waste of time. Jamie started to respond, and then she simply said, "That's the defense." right? The defense is, I don't need it, which of course is not true. It's something we could all benefit from very, very greatly. So the therapist, even at our intensives or in our wilderness program, the therapist holds techniques lightly. They hold their theory lightly, and they sit with the client. The second story that I'll combine with the first is I said this not too long ago on my social media feed. I said, it was because my therapist sat with me so patiently for so many years that I learned to be able to sit with myself. She didn't graduate me. She didn't get impatient. She didn't move me along. She didn't get frustrated. She just sat with me, and I suspect it would have been indefinite. I mean, she's still with me, so it's getting close to being indefinite for her. But because she sat with me, I was able to sit with myself. So that experience I had just a few days ago, that was the result of that. I could sit with my quote unquote horrible, rotten self, unquote, and tolerate it and lean into it and own it and know that I made a mistake. In this particular instance, I said something thoughtless. They give their presence to you and they welcome you, all of you, into the session. Everything that you think is neurotic, shameful, they welcome it, right? They have a compassionate, understanding, patient response to you. And there's something I've taught our therapists this. Therapy doesn't leave you feeling good, not simply every time, but effective therapy gives you some comfort. It makes you feel less alone. One of the reasons, one of the many reasons why so many people are struggling right now, and there are many, is because we're cut off from each other to some degree. There are barriers between us and others. I was talking to somebody on one of our Zoom calls, and they were describing New York and how 9/11 kind of brought everybody together, but now their experience was walking down the street that everybody was the enemy, right? Because everybody was a potential COVID carrier. So what the therapist does with their presence is they give you a sense that you're not alone, and that offers comfort. We as parents sometimes, because we're so connected to our children's pain, when we react with fear or anxiety, like in the expression of something like a gasp like that, what we're communicating to the child is that we're not safe. We need to be taken care of. We need for them to show up a certain way so that we don't feel anxious or afraid or hurt or upset or sad or scared, whatever it is. The therapist develops a practice where they respond with compassion, curiosity. They give you their presence. And as I started to say with our therapist, I said, look, sometimes you're going to welcome somebody and their story into a session where pain is going to become sharper for them, right? Grief, for example, is not something that can be escaped, not effectively for the long run. But there will be an experience where they will feel better in their pain, in their sadness, even in their loneliness. And that's what the presence does. It's a compassionate response, right? What I love about mental health, and I am so there's almost nothing in this life that I have more gratitude for than being a therapist, being trained as a therapist and being in therapy, is that the mental health lens that I get to look through in life offers immediate, intense compassion. I'm so glad to have that lens because it's not a right or a wrong lens. Like Rumi says in his famous poem, Out Beyond the Field of Right and Wrong Doing. I mean, out beyond right and wrong doing, there's a field and I will meet you there, something like that. That's what therapy is. It's not right or wrong, it's healed or wounded, right? It is our wounds that cause us to hurt ourselves and other people, right? Hurt people hurt people. And so when you can find somebody's story, like the Longfellow quote that I gave earlier, compassion is immediately born out of that place. And that's what I love about it. They listen to understand to not and not to diagnose. Now there's some overlap with some of these, but let me talk about number two. It is very easy to use your graduate school language to pathologize clients, right? To make them sick. Diagnosis in its best use is a kind of shorthand where we describe somebody's patterns of behavior in their way of coping with pain or trauma or hurt or fear, whatever it is, right? That's the best use for it. But the therapist doesn't throw that at the client, right? That tends to provoke a defense, shame, right? To make us bad. I remember when I said to the boys, I just wrote a letter to one of the groups because they wrote a letter to me this week. And I said, I love you guys. And I said this to the group when I left the last time I was out there. I said, I love you guys. And yeah, you've messed up, but less than I have, as a matter of fact. And if there's one thing that I want to leave with you, it's this belief that I have that you're okay. You're just struggling. So you don't pathologize. You don't take, that we use words like narcissism and borderline and depressed and anxious. We use them to hide derision, to hide our frustration, to shame or make the client feel bad. I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with over the years who have been told by their therapist, that's just your narcissism. That's just your anxiety. That's just your twisted thinking, your thinking error. I think I told you the story of a former client where I visited where the program suggested that he was maybe sociopathic, which I knew wasn't true, just by the odds and just by the little that I knew. And really what he was anxious, but he'd been told, because he wasn't completely honest in some certain situations, that he was a sociopath. And really what that was the therapist taking their shame, their lack of capacity, their insecurity, and putting it on the client. And frankly, this particular child had a fantastic reason not to trust this context. And it wasn't because he was abused, because he wasn't. But it was because the people around him were constantly, anxiously trying to take from him something that he couldn't give. They were trying to take create their own sense of well-being, serenity, and he couldn't give it. And his solution was to shut off caring because it was too unsafe of a world to live in. The therapist remains curious, right? Always going back to curiosity, not too sure of themselves, right? They're agile. When they offer an idea, they're ready to drop it if the client doesn't agree with it, or if the client doesn't identify with it, or isn't ready for it. Like I said, they see the wound or the trauma rather than focusing on the defense, the symptom, or the diagnosis. I talk about that story in my book about two parents convinced with letters from psychologists that the co-parent, their ex-spouse, the parents of a boy I was working with in the woods, the ex-spouse, the co-parent was sick in this certain way with this certain diagnosis. And both asked me, begged me not to be manipulated or fooled. And when I was asked by the second one specifically, because I'd already had the first phone call, I was asked, did you see it? Were you fooled by it? Or could you see clearly what I have papers to prove is true? And I responded, well, I imagine I can see some of the patterns that you're describing, but mostly I just looked for the wound, right? The problem is, for example, with narcissism, is our countertransference. Countertransference is the way we feel towards the client. And think about this. Imagine, if you can, a narcissist, okay? Imagine one. Somebody in your life, somebody that you don't know, but you can imagine somebody that's a narcissist. What is your instinct with a narcissist? It's to try to knock them down to size, isn't it? It's to try to prove to them that they're not better than everybody else, that they're human, that they make mistakes. But the narcissistic wound is not being seen, not having the whole self be valued, but rather being valued for some kind of part object. The narcissistic wound comes when a parent, because of their own unhealed narcissism, requires the child to take care of them. And then boundaries are confusing, often permissive. But the therapeutic response to, for example, narcissism is compassion, understanding, not a battle. The therapist listens to find the context, like I described, where the struggle, symptoms, and issues make perfect sense. They sit with you so you can sit with yourself. Master therapists pride themselves on what they don't know and what they don't say. I wrote an article in Psychology Today a few weeks ago about the abuse of therapist-initiated graduating clients. I've had many clients over the years who have told me, adult clients who have told me, that they were graduated by a previous therapist, that the therapist initiated the graduation in terms of, you're done, you don't need me anymore, you seem fine. And while you would think on the surface that wouldn't cause somebody to feel shame, the people that have told me that said they felt shame, rejected, confused, hurt. So what was happening in that instance is the therapist was feeling inadequate in their ability to help the client who wasn't presenting an acute issue to problem solve. And so instead of sitting with that uneasy feeling inside of themselves, the therapist moved the person on. In this way of thinking, what I'm talking about tonight, I would never think of graduating you. I'm talking about outpatient practice. I'm not talking about Evoke. We definitely will decide when this course of treatment is up for it has ended for the next one to begin. But in outpatient therapy, I wouldn't graduate you, right? Because I'm here for whatever you need. If you want to graduate, you can leave at any time, right? You don't have to come back at all. But it's not my hour. It's yours. You paid for the hour. And so as long as I feel safe and okay, as long as I feel like I can help you, I'm going to stay with you. And if I don't feel like I can help you, I make it about me, because it is about me, right? If I feel inadequate to the task to help you, I own that feeling. I own that feeling. If a therapist gets upset, if you get upset with a therapist, excuse me, this is number 3. If you get upset with a therapist, they don't make it about you. This might be the biggest tip, hack to figuring out whether or not you have an adequate therapist, a good enough therapist. Tell them you're upset with how therapy is going. Tell them you're upset with something they said or did. I don't mean to make it up, but tell them when it happens. And if they make it about your mixed up thinking, your disorder, your misunderstanding of them, you know you have a therapist that is not willing or able to sit with themselves. But if they welcome and express feeling honored that you would tell them, thank you for sharing, you know you have a good one. That's how a therapist, really, that's how, in our best moments, in our best days, that's how we all respond to each other, right? That's what we teach you parents and even spouses to respond to each other. And when you don't have the capacity to respond that way, then there's some practice of self-care that would be beneficial for you to fill up your belly so that you have the energy and the spiritual and emotional strength to be able to do that. But that's what it sounds like when an adult shows up. Because they have transcended the need to be good, to be perfect, and they have accepted and surrendered to being human, fallible, imperfect, not right. So that's kind of a hack, like a trick, a shortcut to find. I'm not saying you play games and just do it for fun with your therapist, but therapists make plenty of mistakes. It's one of the reasons why I often tell inquiring parents in our program that even if they're not going to choose our program, find some things to be sorry for and tell your children you're sorry. Parents fear to do that, right? They fear to write what we call the letter of accountability or the letter of awareness to the child, kind of the confession of owning up to making an amends for the mistakes that they've made. And what they tell me, their reluctance is based on the idea that the child is going to use it against them. But if you've given up on the power struggle and being right, they can't use it against you. It's kind of impossible. And the amends is given freely. The amends is given without any expectation of anything back, including forgiveness. So there's deep wisdom in this particular step that doesn't just apply to the therapeutic relationship, but that we can borrow from. Like I said, they don't need to be good or right. In my book, my new book, I say this. This is maybe my favorite line in the whole book, which goes something like this. In this way of thinking, you don't get to be right anymore, but you get to be a self, and being a self is so much better. They can see the situation from your side. They're able to mentalize, which means put themselves in your shoes, empathize and understand. They don't try to explain it away. Even if they don't make it about you, they don't try to explain it away. Like I was telling the story earlier, I wanted to create a situation or a world where I didn't do what I did do. I wanted to spin it somehow. And that's why I think mental health could be, in part, defined by the ability to make friends with our mental illness. That's a strong phrase, mental illness, but to make friends with our horrible, rotten self, to make friends with our human self, our fallible self, our sometimes ignorant, insensitive, thoughtless self. And when you make friends with it, you're not at war and you don't need to talk anybody out of it. You don't need to be good. It's so free. I've gone as far to say if you just accept, once you accept your horrible, rotten self, you're free. That's what that's his idea, right? That therapy, the goal of therapy is freedom. Freedom from unconscious obligations. They don't explain it away. They don't get angry. This is really important and can be confusing if we haven't done our work in this area. But the therapist doesn't get angry, frustrated, exasperated, and they will because they're imperfect. When they do, they'll own it and apologize for it. But they won't stand in righteous anger. I have had so many young people think about this. The leverage that we have over the young people that we work with at Evoke and in these programs. We have so much leverage. On top of the fact that we're just an adult, we're bigger than them. We occupy a different space in their heads than they do in ours. I've had so many clients that talked about their therapist getting angry or upset or frustrated with them. And the therapist justified it by saying it came out of a good intention. And it doesn't. And it's not justified. It's human, right? It's human. When confronted with our inability to control somebody, or somebody doesn't meet what we hope or expect, we can get upset, but that's ours, not theirs. It's not their responsibility. And if we try to suggest to them that our being upset is somehow some kind of moral high ground, some kind of moral North Star for them, then they go out in the world with a vulnerability that is really hard to fix, which is they think what other people think about them is about them, and it's not. Right? The human brain will not distinguish at a fundamental level the feelings from a parent and the feelings from a peer or a spouse or a child later on. If they grow up believing that what mom and dad think and feel about them is about them, then when peers get upset or disappointed or frustrated, or spouses or even their children later on, they'll think it's about them. And the defense will be born. That's why therapy, the experience of therapy is such a reparative process. It's kind of a reparenting. That's why it takes years, not weeks. And why for you and for your child, what we hope to do is to get it started, to get it on a path that is, to give people a spark of hope of what it can be, so that everybody continues to work for years. In my way of thinking, for the rest of their life, the same way they would pay attention to anything that betters them. Number 4, this kind of goes off the last one, apologizes when they make a mistake. They're really good at losing. An adequate therapist is really good at losing and is okay with being wrong. Same with a parent and a spouse. They apologize sincerely, even when you don't bring it up sometimes, right? They'll recognize something they may have done. My therapist will apologize to me for things that I didn't even think of or notice. But she's paying attention. Last week, Jamie said on the broadcast, she said, a therapist who's serious, because this is serious business. Not one who can't laugh or have fun, but who talks about the seriousness of us, of our wounds, of our life, of our hurts. They don't take themselves too seriously and they don't need to protect a fragile sense of themselves, right? That's an adequate therapist. This one might be the most insidious. This is number 5, I believe. They are not anxious to fix you. Right? They're not overly anxious or eager to take away your pain, your struggle, or your difficulties, which seems maybe counterintuitive, because most people say, well, that would be a good thing. Rather, they sit with you as you move through your grief and your pain. Right? The best way to take away somebody's pain is opiates, alcohol, right? The things that people get sent to treatment for, cutting, suicidal ideation, school refusal, on and on and on, eating disorders. The things that people get sent to therapy for are the things that they use to self-medicate to take away pain. So the therapist looks to offer you comfort as you walk through your pain. And they're slow to try to fix it, because fix it in a way is to erase, ignore, dismiss the original wound. They won't say you're overreacting. They'll say, I'm very curious about your reaction. It sounds like there's something there. It sounds like this relates to something that happened to you. Let's explore that. Let's look into that. And you'll say, no, I just blew up over nothing. And they'll say, no, I don't think it was nothing. It was probably something. It was just an invisible force from your past that if we spend a little time, we might be able to discover, because it comes up a lot for you, if you're willing to, if that idea makes any sense to you. They're slow to offer solutions. Again, therapists that get very technique driven often want to get to solutions. It makes them feel so much less anxious. Instead, we learn to sit with people. We learn to go through it with them. We learn to honor the defense, to honor the wound that lies beneath the defense. They're not going to be so assignment focused. Now, at Evoke, we give lots of assignments, right? That's a part of it. Evoke, being in a treatment program, is a little bit different than outpatient therapy, but I'm talking about outpatient therapy. They give very few assignments. They might offer them lightly. Sometimes I'll offer an assignment to somebody and I'll say, I'll never follow up. And you don't have to do it. I even remember one time I had a young adult. I was supervising a therapist of ours, and I was visiting a young adult who had just been with us for a couple of weeks, and he was very proud to bring not just the assignments he was given, but some of the assignments in the packet that he hadn't even been assigned yet. And the therapist I was supervising was effusive in his praise of this young adult gentleman. So excited, so reinforcing. And as I watched it, I started to get curious and ask questions. And after the session was over, I turned to the therapist. I said, "You might be a little bit careful about that." And he said, "What do you mean? I'm trying to reinforce positive behavior." And I said, "But what happens when he doesn't do it? Will you be disappointed?" Right? If you load so heavily onto him your emotional excitement, he'll come to believe that that's how he's going to know whether or not he's doing the right thing. And we already talked about on this broadcast about how that makes them vulnerable to losing a sense of themselves in relationships with others. And sure enough, this young man, I talked with his parents, we followed the course, and he was a pleaser and did not know himself. Could not answer the most simple, but perhaps the most difficult question in therapy, which is, what do you want? Right? That was his struggle. And so his overperformance with assignments and the therapist's instinct to reinforce that with lots of praise and positive emotion was a misstep. Right? Instead, I suggested to him, just be curious, hold it lightly. Don't get too excited at the highs. Don't get too disappointed in the lows. Be curious. And then the person has to work out for themselves their own life and who they are. You can still have boundaries, right? You can still have boundaries as a therapist in our program. You can still have boundaries in your home. You can do that. That's part of having a self. A healthy self will have clear, appropriate, consistent boundaries. But we don't use our emotions to reinforce behavior. We're slow to do that. And we don't want the client to feel like they owe it to us. A lot of clients will be ashamed when they don't complete assignments, so they won't come back. Or they'll skip the session. This therapist does not need you to get better. This might be the most difficult one, but really, really important. They don't need you to get better. And what I love about our students in our program, our clients in our program, is they can smell a therapist who needs them to get better. Either because it fulfills some emotional need in the therapist because of something they didn't get met by their parents in their own childhood, or maybe the pressure of responding to parents or an educational consultant or a referring professional. They can smell it, some of them, and they will not give you progress because they will not be turned into an object, a thing to satisfy you. And there are many clients who are incredibly perceptive at sensing that and responding in that way. The therapist doesn't get tired and exhausted by your struggle. That's what makes analysis so. Jamie said last week that her recommendation, which happens to be mine, I didn't know how she was going to answer that. I'd never asked her the question specifically. But when I asked her what to look for in a therapist, she said, look for somebody who's trained in attachment and analysis, because those theories do so well to describe how the personality is built brick by brick, board by board, from the foundation up. And those two models are extraordinarily patient. And the example I was going to give from analysis, imagine going to an analyst 2 or 3 times a week for 8 or 10 years and never being graduated, and them not getting sick of you, and them not needing you to do well, and not getting tired of the same old story, the same old struggle that you yourself are tired of telling, but they are not tired of hearing. When I hear a client embarrassed that they're bringing up an issue that they had 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 6 months ago, 5 years ago, I can hear the transference. I can hear them expecting and waiting for me, because it's happened to them in their past, to be frustrated with it. It's happened to them in earlier contexts. The therapist is not too sure of themselves when it comes to what you should do. They just don't know. They just don't know. They can talk about pros and cons, costs and benefits, risks and rewards, but they don't know what you should do. And again, this lends itself to many other relationships, not knowing what somebody should do. It's one of those things that with some training, you just don't hear it the same way anymore. You just don't hear it. A therapist that I'm describing knows that they don't know your truth. Number six, they're able to laugh at themselves. They don't take themselves too seriously, right? They can laugh at their mistakes, their idiocies, their missteps. This is really, by the way, narcissists do not laugh at themselves. Somebody with a narcissistic wound that's unhealed, that's still wound up inside of them, cannot laugh at themselves. And contrast that with people that we think to be very, very enlightened, the Dalai Lama. I've shared the story that I went to see him at the University of Utah a couple of years ago, and he almost tripped on his way off the stage, and he turned around laughing and said, "Wouldn't that have been a hoot if I just planted my face on the ground?" This while he was wearing a visor from the University of Utah, a tennis visor, and he had initially worn a big medallion around his neck that they give him more as an honorable thing to give, not to wear, but he wore it around his neck like a rap star until it got too tired on his neck, and then he had to take it off. They don't take themselves too seriously. They find it easy to admit what they don't know. This goes to this last one, this seventh one, really goes to, again, lends itself very, very well to the parent role. And that is, the therapist doesn't need to be good or have you think that they are good, right? If you know that you're okay as a therapist, as a parent, doesn't mean that you're perfect, doesn't mean you're without faults, but you know that you're okay, that all of your imperfections are what make you you, and it's okay. Then you can show up for somebody else. Then you can be there for them. Then you can see them. And if a therapist needs you to think that they're good, it's the worst. One of the worst things that we can have, one of the worst characteristics that we can have as a parent or a therapist is the need for the client or the child to see us as good. It is going to be an enormous barrier to providing effective parenting or therapy. You pay for the therapist's time, and that's the end of the deal. That's the end of the exchange from your end, right? You don't owe them anything else. They can terminate therapy if they feel inadequate to the task, or they can terminate therapy if they don't feel safe. They're allowed to do that. But you don't owe them anything. You don't owe them your progress, your success, your getting better. You don't owe them your gratitude. Now, some of this happens, just like problem solving. I talk about therapy not being a problem solving endeavor, but problem solving happens in therapy. But if the therapist gets too focused on problem solving, there you have that agenda again that's going to get in the way of some of the important things that we've talked about tonight. They're okay with being wrong, like I said, and they have a humility that's born from a confidence and a strong sense of themselves, rather than this idea that they need to be seen or believed to be talented or good at their job. Jamie Gill says this: part of the business of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is now noticed and discussed. When you go to Italy, and hopefully we'll be allowed to go there again someday. When you go to Italy, if you're paying attention, you notice your own context is more clear. The fish doesn't know to discover water, is the last one to discover water, because the fish doesn't know not water. So when you sit with an empathic other who's patient, you start to realize, I'm so much more clear after spending 21 years in Jamie's therapy chair. I am so much more clear that the constructions of my childhood with my mother and father were just that, constructions. They were not the truth. They were just that truth. And that idea of good and evil, as defined by my family, is not necessarily how I feel. We don't have the same values. I don't have the same political party, the same religious beliefs as my parents, right? Getting out of our context, experience. That's another thing, is that therapy is an experience. And we do experiential therapy at Evoke. We do wilderness therapy, which is experiential. We do all kinds of experiential activities out there, including psychodrama and many others. But the experience of therapy is showing up, telling the truth about who you are, what you think and feel, and in so doing, taking the risk that the therapist will respond in ways that you've been responded to in your past. And if you're lucky and they don't, it will begin to illuminate your context that you grew up in. How to get the most out of it? Ask difficult questions. I always say that at Evoke. Ask your therapist difficult questions. You deserve intelligent answers. I don't like the phrase trust the process, because I think it can be used by therapists to dismiss clients' well-earned skepticism. Right? If you're skeptical and doubting, I want to hear about it. It makes sense, I'm sure. So ask tough questions, and you don't have to just trust the process. Talk about your experience with a therapist. Like I said, tell them how you feel, tell them what you want. Don't take on their emotions. Don't own their emotions. Make them own their emotions. Give them back to them. That's about them. Do not rationalize their bad behavior with good intentions. We do that a lot. I see people do it with their family. Well, they have the best of intentions. And intentions don't mean that much in the face of abuse. I've seen people who have good intentions who abuse people. And so intentions aren't that important, at least when you're on the receiving end of the behavior. Avoid the guru, the one who needs to be the expert on your life. Don't over-focus on problem solving. I said over-focus because problem solving can happen. But like, for example, when I talk about this COVID pandemic that we're all in right now, that's an unsolvable problem right now for us, not for the scientists, hopefully, who are working on it in the laboratories, but for us, the solutions we have are to shelter in place, right? Social distance. So problem solving happens as a part of, as we discover our truth and our authentic selves and who we are. But an over focus on it won't get at the root issues, right? It's akin to cutting weeds off at the surface. We know what happens when we cut weeds off at the surface. They go and they show up in other parts of the garden. And then to understand, like I said, the experience of therapy is important. To understand that therapy itself is an experiential endeavor. I have one more slide that's slow to come up, so I'm just going to skip it for right now. There's a question that's come up. I'll read that slide when it comes up. It might be that the server here is working slowly. Somebody writes in, I have a family member who has been in twice weekly psychoanalysis for 6 years. I've said to myself many times, he's not getting any better. What a waste. Thank you for this information on shedding light on the role of a therapist. Jamie said this last week, that it'll get worse before it gets better. Even Brene Brown, who's not a psychoanalyst, in her most famous TED Talk said that it was getting worse at one point, and her therapist said, I think you're having a spiritual awakening. And she said, I thought it was a breakdown. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Someone says, you always say that your therapist has been so patient with you. I think you're a good and exceptional client who doesn't want to be fixed or have a solution. I am a therapist myself, and sometimes I get frustrated with my clients' expectations. You know, I don't mean to say that it's perfect. There was times when I thought about quitting, when I thought it wasn't helping. And what did she do when I thought about, considered quitting? She said to me, okay. She didn't try to talk me out of it. One time I stopped going for 6 months in these 21 years. Also, she was okay with whatever I wanted to do because it wasn't her hour. So it's not perfect or flawless. I don't mean to imply that it's and she's had to apologize many times for her response and countertransference to me. And sometimes she's apologized when I haven't even noticed it, like I said. So it's an imperfect process, but it's a process that definitely can be authentic. And I've been upset with clients before and anxious with clients before. I'm my defenses are more sophisticated now than they are when I was younger. When they were younger, I was like a lot of therapists, and I just justified my reactions. I used to tell clients that my anger is just a natural consequence of your behavior. I don't do that anymore. Now I hide them a little bit better, but I still have to apologize. So thank you for sharing that. That's part of being a human therapist. Any other questions? Well, I don't. The slide's not coming up for the last quote, so I'm just going to have to skip it for right now. This kind of therapy is uncommon and rare. It is not commonplace every day. So look for it. It's okay to look for it, to be hungry for it, to ask for it, to talk about it. And you don't have to do this kind. If you want to do these other kinds that are out there, you're welcome to do the other kinds too. This is just what kind of our approach. And like I've said to my therapist when they say to me, well, Brad, we are hired by families to help their children. And I've said to them, this is how you do it. This is how you do it. And when you respond in the ways that I've described tonight, you watch the nervous system in a child or a parent, you watch it relax and downregulate. What's happening when the nervous system downregulates is the prefrontal cortex is coming online. The wise, problem-solving, foreshadowing self, where you can think ahead and anticipate consequences, that part of the brain is coming online. When the nervous system is upregulated, because we are anxious in response to somebody else, the prefrontal cortex is offline. It's hijacked. Talk about it with your therapist. Talk about this with your therapist. Tell them what you need and want out of therapy. Share resources with them, readings. Pay them for the time, but talk about it with them. Talk about what you need and want from therapy. That can be helpful. All right, somebody else has a question. It says, boring question. Well, I'll be the judge of that. Boring question. Could you let us know if expenses related to wilderness program are tax deductible? Perhaps you can direct us towards some good resource or information on the topic. Couple of things. We reach out to your parent coordinator at our program, and they can provide you with a letter that then you can share with your accountant. And they can talk about how it can be applied. We do have a webinar podcast on insurance, but not as much on the tax end of things. But we do have a letter that we can provide for you that you can share with your tax people. So it's not a boring question. It's a very, very important question because money is not, for most of us, is not an endless resource. And we spend a good portion of our lives working to earn money. And now this is a very expensive process. And so the question is really, really important. It's very valuable. So thank you for asking it. Wish I had more information, but the offices can help you with that. Someone says, thanks, Brett. It's very validating to hear our bad therapist experience described in so many ways. I'm glad. All right. Let me go over a couple of upcoming things. We have something exciting that's happening. We are now going to take Finding You online. I suspect that we'll do this long after the COVID outbreak, but we're going to start immediately. We're going to actually have an online intensive on April 24th, 2.5 days, Friday afternoon to Sunday evening. I'll be leading that. And we'll have another one on May 8th through 10th. I suspect it will fill up fast. We're going to keep the group sizes small to 5 or 6. So if you want to sign up for these, please email intensives@evoketherapy.com. All the information will be coming out to you via email blast and on our social media outlets over the next couple of days. But we just decided it today. We just wrote the basic curriculum today. We're going to be doing Finding You online. I'll be leading on a Zoom conference call with 5 or 6 people, April 24th through 26th. That's a weekend, no travel, no expenses from your home, and May 8th through 10th. Intensives@evoketherapy.com. We invite you all to attend and familiarize yourself with 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. Adult children can be a great group if you grew up in a home that you think was toxic or had a lot of alcohol-like behavior there, alcoholic or not. refugerecovery.org is a place to go to get support. Also, it's a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, is a great place to go to get resources during the virus and the time of social distancing. There are a lot of resources that are being put online for people through all these organizations. All of our broadcasts are available on the podcast app. Search your favorite podcast app. Just search Evoke Therapy Programs, or the new name. I need to change that. The new name, which is Finding You, an Evoke Therapy Podcast. On an iPhone, it's the podcast app. On your computer, you can go to SoundCloud.com. Or if you have an Android, we recommend the SoundCloud app. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy by using the tag Evoke Therapy. Or you can find the Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using that tag, Evoke Therapy Intensives. Search Evoke Therapy Programs on Facebook to find our Facebook page. The Evoke Family Foundation is also on Facebook, and the Evoke Therapy blog has new content each week. Both of my books are available on Amazon. I've lowered them to the lowest allowable price on Amazon that Amazon will allow. So The Journey of the Heroic Parent is $12.95, excuse me. The Kindle for Audacity to Be You is only $2.99 for the ebook. During this time, special low price, then $10.02. For some reason, that's the odd price that Amazon would let me lower it to. I'll let you know about the next webinar to be determined. We won't have that date and time set up just yet. Who are the intensives for? They're for the non-identified patient. They're for anybody who wants. We have some podcast webinars on intensives. You can go to your parent portal and search intensives, and you can find them there. But if you're dealing with anxiety, depression, trauma, codependency, relationship transitions in life, confused, looking for greater clarity, looking for more empowerment. It's really just anything in the general mental health field. We don't deal with acute issues of safety to yourself, of course. You need to be stable in terms of your own safety. But we can talk about, it's an exploration into how you became you and why you might be having the challenges you're having in your life or in your relationships now. So it's a very broad net. If you want to learn more, go to the Intensives podcast or webinar and listen there. I've done 9 of them myself. All of my adult children have done them. And that's both of my adult children, I should say. And my wife has done a couple of them herself. So this is a great deep dive into the work. If you're ready to do a deep dive into it, I say for people that have had therapy, it's a therapy accelerator. And for people that are new to therapy, it's a therapy springboard into your work. Someone asked, so as parents, do you recommend we go while our child is in treatment? Yes. The sooner the better, in my opinion. Like I said, I've been going to one for the most part every year for the last 8 or 9 years. I don't think there's a reason to wait. If you go and you tell your child, you'll have so much to share. It'll be such a gift to them. People always ask me, what's the most important thing that you can do for your child to support your child in their work? I don't think there's a good case against what I'm about to say. I believe that it's almost universally true that the best thing you can do, in addition to keeping your child safe and getting them their start in therapy, the best thing you can do is to do your work, specifically to do your intensive work with us or with somebody else. To do your intensive work, that's the best thing you can do to support your child, their progress, and their start in therapy. And it will be a gift to them. They will, when you lean into your work, they will absolutely thank you. You're really taking a heroic step to look at yourself instead of where some people might stay and say, it's not my problem. I'm not the one with the issue. My life was fine. I'm successful, right? That's kind of the defense. But if you're willing to look at yourself and your contribution to this dance, what a gift for your child. So absolutely, the sooner the better. Any more questions before we wrap up this evening, Malia? No more questions, and I couldn't have that last slide. Well, I shared the principle from it, so we'll just have to be satisfied with not getting it. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for participating, showing up. I hope it's a helpful point of contact to you. I know it's a great gift to your child. We're going to be doing Zoom meetings for our alumni and our current families. So you should have got, if you don't have that information, you can email Malia, Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information and to sign up. Those will be on first come, first serve. We're doing them the next couple of nights, and then we'll be back at the webinars next week. Take care, folks. Thank you on behalf of your children for your willingness to do this heroic work that you're doing by showing up here tonight. Take care. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.